All right, following up on the definitional program, we looked at capitalism last time, had some interesting response on that. I think I'll do a follow-up on capitalism to address some of the good questions that came in and sort of, look at some of the surrounding concepts. But today I wanted to look at feminism. So I think this, obviously a vexed topic in some social settings, but generally speaking, this is not that complicated of an issue at its core. And again, this is the power of sort of looking at things from a definitional standpoint. It allows you to get to some core issues that are pretty easy to get your mind around. And then if you work out from those, you can, explore the depths and the complexity. But at its central core, feminism is neither confusing nor controversial. And so I think the key issue here to look at is simply the history of civilization. And this is not just Western civilization, this is civilizations in general. Women have been treated, I think the best way to think about it is as subhuman or partially human. So the tradition in civilizations has been to take men as the standard, and because because women aren't men, therefore they're deviating from the norm. And the norm is, of course, established as men. Therefore, they're lesser beings. Generally, again, if you look at the legal structure or the social structure, the combinations of those linguistic structures, the consensus is that, women, not really people. Or if they are people, they're just barely people, right? So it's that incredibly deep-seated multi-millennium, this thousands of year tradition of treating women as if they are not actually human. So of course there's been, various pushbacks against this. You can look in history, Epicurus famously allowed women in his garden where they studied philosophy, and this made people very suspicious of him. There's been other moments in other cultures, but generally speaking, 99.9% of the time, the working assumption has been that women just aren't human. So, pick a date and time when this starts to, switch, and pick a location. But, if you think around, mid 1750s to 1800, you start getting the growth of an educated class of women who have the resources and the opportunity to begin saying, hey, you know what? We think we might actually be people, and we deserve to be treated as people, and we want to start redressing these issues. So feminism is broadly conceived of as the attempt to think about, redress, understand the sort of cultural implications of taking women and treating them as if they're, subhuman, not equal citizens of your country. By the way, this is why voting rights are so important. When you can vote, you really count as a citizen. And it's only about 100 years ago in the United States that women actually finally were able to get the right to vote. They fought for the right. They won the right to vote. And that, when you think of the long arc of history, women have only been full citizens in many instances, in many countries, for an incredibly short period of time. And of course, today, inequality still, reigns in much of the world, dramatic inequality. The traditional structures still exist. China, is working hard in legal ways, but, cultural is still a struggle, and basically everywhere there's still a struggle, but we're a lot farther along than we used to be. And this is sort of the core essence of feminism. So really not complicated or even controversial, because you can't look at world history and go, oh no, women have been treated equally, because it's just nonsense. There's just zero evidence of that. And, the attempt to redress it, what do you call that? You need a name for that. So let's call it feminism. Why not? Okay, so central core issue is very simple. At this point, it gets wildly more complicated. And I think this is where some of the issues arise. Now, how you decide to redress this, because it is so deeply seated in the historical, cultural, linguistic, legal, political, family, and every struggle, religious, you name the cultural, social structure, this, maltreatment of women is just deep in it. We'll have traditions that go way, way back. And so to redress these issues is not simple. There is no we'll do this. Women get the right to vote. Everything will be fine. Women, the right to vote, yes, but that doesn't make everything fine, if only. So you have many, many feminisms, right? There's many within this broad definition of what feminism is, attempt to redress or understand or study or reflect on or rethink the structures of society that have given us this heritage. Yeah, take your pick. I mean, there truly are just dozens, if not hundreds of different approaches. And that complexity, I think, is where people really get frustrated and they get upset because they want to say, this is feminism and that's not, or this is bad and this is good. And that sort of endless desire to try and oversimplify and put things in little neat boxes, of course, damages your ability to understand or think about the world. And so for people who want to aggress against feminism, right, they say, oh, well, this idea here, if someone says, particular, I don't know, controversial, I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. Say, for instance, like the gender movement who says, okay, look, there is no such thing as gender. We'll just take that as a position. That's grossly oversimplified. Well, somebody who does not like feminism can look at that and say, okay, well, feminism says there is no such thing as gender. Therefore, I think feminism is silly and I can just ignore the whole thing, right? So that's the sort of dismissive, oversimplification that allows people use as a tool to attack things they don't like. And so again, that's where you come back to the definitional thing and you can just say, hey, look, maybe you don't agree about the gender issue. We can debate about that, but do you agree about this core definition? Do you think that women have had this historical problem? And what do you think is the best way to redress it? And that way, that opens up at least the possibility for a conversation because they can say, oh yeah, I think this approach over here is silly, but why don't we do something like this? Well, now we're talking about a debate within the structure of, okay, what is the best way to address this? Because there is no agreement about the best way because there's so many things that need to be done and there's so many ways to approach doing them that why would there be? Another aspect of this, besides the oversimplification to avoid thinking, is also it's an oversimplification because I think this is actually tied to the notion of, I want feminism to be one thing and I want feminists to be one thing because I want women to be one thing, which is, of course, goes all the way back to the old, this is just the reappearance of the multi-thousand-year cultural structure. Hello, welcome back. I want women to be one single thing like they used to be in the magical good past. Of course, this is absurd, but it is a common refrain. I think maybe the most common expression of that is to say, well, the difference between men and women is, women, they have babies, right? They have babies. That's it. So women are those things that have babies. That makes everything else, like the entire cultural history, everything, every possible linguistic and political disability somehow makes sense. Of course, it does not. It's totally absurd. If you think about it, if you stop and think for a moment, women can have children, but they don't necessarily have to. So one, you could say the capacity to have is perhaps defining, but many women do not have children, so it becomes less problematic. And even if a woman does have children, let's say if you're a woman, you have two children, that act, producing children, this takes maybe, if you live to be, say, 75, something like 3% of your life. 3% of your life would be being pregnant, having the child and recovering from childbirth, right? So that would be, 3%. So the other 97% of your life, you're doing something else, and so it's just, to me, it always is just this crazy notion of taking those 3% and saying either the possibility, you don't have to actually do it, but the possibility you could have kids, or the act that takes maybe 3% of your life. If you have two kids, if you have one kid, of course, less. If you have more kids, a little more. Then, what a weird way to define somebody. Really, and clearly this is just an attempt to oversimplify and narrow it down. So I sometimes think often think that this desire to say, this thing here is feminism and that person is a feminist and they represent this entire field, is a way of saying, women are one thing, and therefore once we figure out that one thing, then we're done with this and we can dismiss feminism as being, just this crazy thing from out there that we don't have to pay attention to, rather than trying to engage with it. Now, where it gets more complicated, of course, is that there isn't one feminism that would get, as we talked about, this would be absurd. There's, multifaceted number. and every possible range, because, not surprisingly, the question, this historic treating of women as second class, third class citizens, or not even as people, affects every possible part of society. And so, it's linguistic. The famous case in Japan where women aren't supposed to say certain things, they aren't supposed to address people certain ways. And so essentially it is impossible for them to talk like someone who's in charge to a man because they can't use that language to a man. I mean, it's actually grammatically incorrect. And so here's a language that grammatically disables women. I mean, think about that. That's incredibly powerful. So, not surprising, a lot of women, like scholars and researchers who are interested in language and these sorts of issues, want to look at language. They want to look at the linguistic issues surrounding how we use language, how that reinforces these sorts of stereotypes and biases and disables women. I mean, it's an interesting, real, complex, and subtle question because, of course, language is a totally vexed subject anyway. And then you can take somebody like, psychology, right? So let's look at this psychological issue surrounding this. So, now you're just already you have psychology, that's a mire. Then you go in there and you say, okay, now let's roll this core feminist outlook. Like, okay, how do we look at psychology and use those insights to address the position women find themselves in? Wow, now you've made a complex, subtle subject more complex and more subtle and difficult. And so, this is where people like, speaking of language, right, where you get someone like Jacques Lacan, who takes sort of Freudian insights and mixes it with, French, linguistic analysis. And then you get, some of his female students or people who studied him, come along, Chris Davis, Shishu, they're like, oh, hey, let's apply these incredibly complex and subtle philosophical structures to understanding how this impacts women. And then there's a lot of feminists who think, well, that's just a bunch of nonsensical French, post-structural garbage. We're interested in economic equality, right? Well, good, economics, there's no problem there. That's a clear field, so, right? And then you're off and running, right? So you can have this expression of this core subject can come out and should and does come out in any number of ways. And that's healthy and that's real and that's vibrant. It's artificial to say, oh, well, that one manifestation of it is feminism in total. And then, of course, what we want to do is attack that one manifestation because for some reason we think it's an easy target, whoever's doing the attacking. And so this is why I think definitions are so helpful in getting clarity on our ideas, is because we can go, oh, are you saying you dislike this one aspect of feminism, which is totally fine. Nobody likes all the aspects of feminism. But still, are you there with the core of it to say, hey, we got to come up with ways to address this? And again, the simplest way to always do that is to say, right, you don't agree with that expression. How would you try to deal with the problem that these people are trying to deal with that you find that you don't like? So for instance, I find it difficult, the whole attempt to change pronoun usage. And it's like, it muddles the language up. And this is really where my core struggle is that some things that you can express clearly become vague. And it seems like a key feature of language, and always a struggle, is trying to communicate clearly. And so I'm always, I'm going to resist, linguistic changes or language usages that try to muddy the water up. So I think most bureaucracy is so terrible because it just uses all this horrible language to obscure rather than to make clear. And so I find like when you change the, his and hers to theirs or them, or it's like, oh, well, that's not really what was meant. Also, it creates a historical problem of most of our texts, or pretty much all of our texts, have been written in another standard. But this doesn't make the standard right? This is why it's such a vexed problem. You can see there's a language bias when if the sex of things is him or her, if it's always defaults to the male, well, this is just simply linguistic bias, right? I don't know how you get around that. It's just what it is. And so I'm like, I find that vexatious. And I like to talk to people about this because I think it's an interesting problem in language and how you express these issues and use references and pronouns. But that doesn't mean I have to agree with everybody about them. But we can talk as long as we agree that there is this core definition of feminism and that we agree about like sort of what the goal is. And we just disagree on what this moment, this detail, this aspect of it, what the best way might be to, redress it. That is a very different situation than someone who says, is using the attack on the single, example of whatever feminism they dislike as a way of not having to address the whole. And this is another aspect that definition really helps with. Same thing with capitalism. So if I say, that I hate capitalism, we'll take out feminism for a second, and I go, well, that's weird because capitalism is this huge, complex, structure, and it's usually what they mean is they dislike a certain aspect of it. But if what they mean is just like, I don't want to think about economics at all, I think the world should be a Edenic paradise, pre-industrial. We all just, eat plants that blossom on trees and you're just done. And we live full human lives that way. Well, I can't talk to that person basically because that's not very well informed about the entirety of human history and economic development and all this other subtle stuff. However, if they are really just like, oh, no, I think, the transnational corporations' abuses of, tax evasion to rip off countries. I'm like, oh yeah, that's a great subject. Let's talk about that, right? That's definitely, you can be opposed to that and not necessarily be opposed to capitalism, right? Those are not the same thing. You're just labeling it that way. And that way we can communicate better. With feminism, if you find people who just say, oh, look, this whole thing is silly because what they mean is that, women should just shut up and be in their places and stop bothering us and messing things up. Well, you can't talk to that person, right? If that's their core, if that's their base, basically you don't want to spend your time reading them, or you don't want to spend their time trying to understand them or trying to debate them because their mind is not open because they don't accept the core definition. To them, the definition of feminism is women being stupid, right? Women misunderstanding their role and place in society. And so that definition doesn't function. And so this is the power of having clear definitions and making sure that you can kind of share definitions with people when you're communicating, is you can know if you're actually capable of communicating. Sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, particularly on vexatious subjects, religion, feminism, politics, capitalism, you can't, because many people have already made their minds up about what they think they know, and their minds are closed. On the other hand, it does open up real possibilities for exploring ideas when you realize like, hey, no, there's a core here that we can pretty much agree on. And then you're free to explore. Then you go, oh yeah, well, we sort of agree on this core. Now we can explore the various manifestations, the various ideas. Where does it come from? What's the best way, for instance, it's one of these difficult, what's the best way to address the inequality in women's wages? How systematic. There's no legal thing that says you have to pay women less. This has always been cultural, right? This is one of those cultural expressions that's come out. It's just it was always assumed that it was okay to pay women less because, of course, women are 3/4 of a human being, right? That's that deep cultural history. And that 100 years after we have the voting rights in the United States, after we've had a booming economy, after we have women getting masses of education, after we have all the sort of positive role models in public and in the media and in corporations, the fact that women still earn whatever it is, 22 cents less. I mean, it's just it's just like the gap is, it's unbelievable, basically. It's like, how can that have persisted for so long? And then, you get all the egregious examples of people having exactly the same job, a man and a woman. And then the woman finds out that, well, the man's getting like 30% more, right? And if this happened once a year, it wouldn't be a problem. But this is a consistent pattern. And, all the research, I think, supports pretty strongly that this is a consistent pattern. And you go, but how do you do that? I mean, you can pass a law that says everybody has to be paid the same. Maybe that's a good start, but it's really, the problem with cultural things like this is that it's extraordinarily difficult to enforce as a law. So law might be a fine idea, but then it really questions, how do you get at the cultural roots of that? How do you convince people that, there should be equitable pay? And part of it may simply be that this may be where, like the capitalism and the feminism problem overlap, where people see an opportunity to exploit certain people, in this case women, to maximize profit, right? Because, oh, if I can pay a manager 20% less, my budget just looks good. So I'll promote a woman, but I'll give her less. And therefore that's a win for, my corporate division or my structure or my business where I am. And it's like, oh, so here's where like the sort of exploitative, capitalist model meets the exploitative feminine, right? And it's like, so you're not trying to undo one thing there, you're trying to undo two sort of deep cultural structures, although the feminist, the women structure is very much deeper, of course, than the capitalist structure. And so, how do you redress that? I mean, a really difficult problem. Again, passing a law is a fine idea. It's just that laws often don't function that well. For instance, civil rights laws were passed, which is great. It just, of course, hasn't led to a perfect world of equality. So then the question becomes, how do you then deal with this? So just a brief review then. I think this is again, I think generally I'm just arguing for the power of and the utility of having a clear idea of the subject that's being discussed. Because so often when we're doing controversial subjects, we don't have either people don't have an operating definition. They just mean it's bad or it's good, which of course disables your thinking entirely. Or they have just a really narrow or tendentious definition that's unhelpful. And often I find when conversation with people, if we can kind of meet and go, oh, hey, how about this? Here's some shared ground. Then it really opens things up. Then explorations, ideas, and everything can flow. If we don't ever find that we have a shared ground, it tends to be sterile. Nothing productive happens. And it's just, a bunch of jargon going back and forth. And it's sort of useless and just not very life affirming in general. So power of definition. And in this case, I think with feminism, you can just think of it as an attempt to think, or the attempts to think through these deep-seated cultural inheritances that have put women in a subservient position in like so many subtle and not subtle ways. And then, how do you think your way out of that? How do you redress this? And that, if you think of that as the core of feminism, and then everything else is growing out of that, I think it just makes it more interesting, easier to talk to people, and easier to understand the many wonderful, amazing, vexatious complexities that are there. So feminism. Thank you.